If you're a North Korea news aficionado like me, you probably came across the NK News website well before discovering the podcast. It's an incredible source that gets you behind the headlines to give you what's probably the most reliable and evidence-based news on North Korea. Every business day, you'll get between 5 to 10 articles that provide exclusive news, detailed analysis, and informed opinions. And guess what? Each week they send you forward-looking week-ahead briefings and news alerts to keep you ahead of the curve. There's more. NK News members also get special reader-only benefits, access to exclusive events and online conferences, and perpetual access to our archive of podcasts. And here's the best part, you can get a $100 discount on your annual subscription with the code PODCAST. Redeem this podcast-only special today by visiting nknews.org/discount. That's nknews.org/discount. Hello, listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm recording this short pre-interview on Tuesday, the 29th of August, 2023, doing it via Zoom. And we have on the show one of my excellent colleagues from NK News and NK Pro, Colin Zwirko. Colin, welcome back on the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Colin, how was your civil defense drill last week?
Yeah, that was a bit underwhelming. Yeah, it didn't seem like many people out here were paying too much attention to it, but, at least personally, I feel prepared.
I live in a building that is a mixed-use residential and commercial building, and I went down to the management office before the drill on the same day, so let's say maybe around 10, 11 a.m. in the morning, and I asked the management office people, where is our nearest shelter? And they looked at themselves and looked at me with confusion, and nobody knew and nobody thought to ask.
Yeah, I think it was the same around here. The doors in our building were locked, except for the revolving door, and I asked the first floor attendant guy, and he said, they're locked because it's raining. We don't want the floor to get slippery. So that was fun.
And there's a building next door to where I live, which is an office building, which is, according to Cacao Maps, listed as a civil defense drill depisor, or place of evacuation or shelter. And I went to the first floor. This is after the drill, and I asked, did you have people coming here to use the shelter? And he said, oh, no, this shelter is only for people who work in the building.
Yeah.
We don't let outsiders in. And I said, but it's listed on Cacao Maps. And he said, well, I guess in case of an actual emergency, people might be able to come in, but normally we don't. So, yeah, I saw a lot of ignorance, a lot of confusion, a lot of complacency.
Yeah, a lot of I got that sentiment too, that, this isn't an actual emergency, so we're not really going to change anything.
Right. Yeah.
But, I don't think the risk is too high for nuclear war, but maybe that's just me.
Maybe, yeah, exactly. Now, in the last week, we had another satellite launched by North Korea, another failure. What happened?
Yes. So this is this time, actually, South Korean people were not alerted to go seek shelter for this satellite launch, like the one in May.
May 31st,
So back in May, at the end of May, North Korea made their first attempt to launch a military reconnaissance satellite into orbit, and it exploded, or no, it didn't explode. It fell because the second stage engine didn't ignite. And then North Korea said they would try again.
Right.
Then they announced last week that they would try again starting anywhere between August 24th and the end of the month. And then they went with their very first opportunity within that window, and they launched it sort of surprisingly at just before 4 a.m. On August 24th. So they launched the satellite rocket. It made it past the first stage separation.
Yep.
The second stage separation as well, according to North Korean state media, and also I think South Korean military also agreed. So it did better than the last one, but then it exploded at the third stage. So it failed. And North Korea came out right away, just a couple hours after the explosion, and said, failed, but we're going to try again in October. So North Korea is being much more confident this time. They've actually improved upon the last launch, but they said that some sort of self-destruct mechanism caused the failure. So this seems to be an accident, but we don't have enough information to know if this was like a triggered accident or some sort of automated system that accidentally went off. So
now with the May 31st launch failure, the the satellite was eventually salvaged from the bottom of the sea by the South Korean Navy, I think. In this case, because it exploded, I'm guessing there's nothing to salvage, right? Or maybe just little bits and pieces, but not a whole satellite.
Right. I'm still skeptical about what the South Korean government says that they recovered, because they're not being transparent about it. They're not showing photos. They're not giving out technical details. They released a really, what I think is a political statement saying that they analyzed it and that it had no military use. So they're criticizing it as basically useless. But we heard, behind the scenes that the U.S. didn't approve of this statement, and they haven't really proven their claims. So apparently, I guess, there was no self-destruct mechanism that went off last time in May, but this time there was. And we've also heard that even the first stage, which the South Koreans recovered fully, well, they recovered a large section of the rocket back in June after the May launch, that this time that first rocket debris that dropped actually exploded into many pieces. I haven't seen that this is confirmed, but South Korea is out there trying to recover it. And maybe this means that North Korea installed a self-destruct mechanism in each stage that was intended to drop, so that the South Koreans couldn't get a hold of it and glean information about the program.
Right. And people who want to know more should definitely go to nknews.org and read our stories, including your excellent story last week on the day of the satellite launch and failure. Now, after months of speculation, some of it here on this podcast, but we, of course, did very low-level and very careful speculation, it seems that North Korea is finally doing a partial border opening and allowing its citizens to return back to the mother country for the first time since early 2020. And that's been reported in the Rodong Shinmun. Tell us a bit more about that, Colin.
Yeah, so this was 2 days ago on Sunday. This is significant because North Korea is actually telling its the domestic population that the borders are opening to North Koreans. So, back in July, we had the first foreign delegation visits going to North Korea in the form of Russians and Chinese, a Russian military delegation and a Chinese political delegation at a high level. Many people, dozens of people came into the country. The North Korean population saw this and they would have thought, okay, well, what about, these are people with relative influence, relatively middle class type people in North Korea would have been thinking, well, my family member who's a diplomat has been stuck abroad for 3 years, not allowed to come home because North Korea closed the borders in January 2020 because of the pandemic. And maybe they were thinking, well, this isn't fair. What's up with this? And the Russians and the Chinese didn't have to go through any quarantine. They just came right in, met with Kim Jong-un, went to military parade, et cetera, et cetera. We found out that the Russian embassy in Pyongyang told us that they had to actually go through quarantine for 1 week after the delegation left. So this means that North Korea conducted these events in a bubble of sorts. And then people who came in contact with the people from abroad then had to go into quarantine. So this indicated that while North Korea was lifting some of their restrictions, they were still very careful and worried about the spread of the virus. So now North Korea on Sunday announced in the Rodong Shinmun, the domestic top newspaper, that people are coming home. North Koreans are allowed to come home. They use the word allowed, but they will have to go through a 7-day quarantine. So this tells us that this is still one of the most restrictive COVID policies in the world, let alone, one of the most restrictive countries in the world. Let's not forget that North Koreans are not allowed to travel around the world freely. They're not allowed to leave their country for political reasons. They've increased border security in the last few years. It's basically a prison nation. But the people are going to start coming home, and we've heard that it's going to be gradual. So Yonhap reported Monday night that 300 North Koreans went into the country over the land border in the northwest. And they're going to continue to come in. They're going to quarantine, but there's no indication yet that tourists are going to start coming in.
Oh, yeah.
Or
diplomats.
More diplomats, rotations for foreign representatives in Pyongyang.
Wow. Okay. And what else have you been looking at in the last few days?
Yeah. So this morning, right now it's Tuesday. This morning, news came out in the Rodong Shinmun that Kim Jong-un visited the naval headquarters near Pyongyang.
Nice photos. A lot of white uniforms. Yeah,
he went there with his daughter, who was still not named in the report, but her first appearance in a few months. He did a speech. This was for Navy Day, which was August 28th on Monday, but they did the visit on Sunday, according to state media. So It's been rare in the last few years that Kim Jong-un has given such attention to the Navy, although, he visited a submarine under construction in 2019. He has reportedly done dozens of inspections of this new underwater nuclear attack drone, quote unquote, called the Hail.
The Hail.
Yeah, that they unveiled this year. And he's done a couple of submarine-launched ballistic missile tests in the last few years. But otherwise, just last week, he did his first surface ship, like first inspection of a warship in over 4 years, almost 5 years, I think. And so he's giving more attention to the Navy these days. His Navy commander, Kim Myung-sik, has been in the role for, I think, a decade. He's got a lot of confidence in the Navy, but it seems like he's just now kind of starting to give more attention, and he's promising that they're going to get their nuclear weapons deployed soon. He says in the future, you're going to be a prime part of our nuclear deterrent. So I think we should expect maybe some more naval weapons reveals in the coming months.
Yeah.
But otherwise, this is all just centered around this holiday of the Navy Day.
Right. I see this story that you've published just this morning titled Kim Jong-un promises nuclear weapon deployment to Navy in visit to HQ. So that's definitely a story that people should go and read. What are the options in terms of nuclear weapons deployment to the Navy? Obviously, the submarines, but is there anything else, or ship-to-air launched missiles or things like that?
So last week, he inspected a warship that's been under construction for over a decade, but it's called the Amnok class. That's the unofficial name. It doesn't really have an official name in state media that they offered, but it's supposed to have stealth capabilities. Experts are skeptical of some of its capabilities. It does not have an anti-air capability that could threaten U.S. reconnaissance planes, for example. Coming after North Korea, and media threatened to shoot down U.S. reconnaissance planes a few times in the last couple of months. But this ship demonstrated a cruise missile launch during Kim's inspection this month, so on the East Coast. And this is a cruise missile that North Korea says is nuclear capable. They haven't really demonstrated this miniaturized nuclear warhead capability yet, but experts can also just assume that it's a real development.
Yeah.
But it's unclear if it's deployed, and so that's equipped on that ship. And then, of course, they also launched that same cruise missile from a submarine earlier this year from torpedo tube, and they're developing nuclear submarine-launched ballistic missiles that they haven't tested something of a large size since 2019, but they're intending to put these on submarines, but they also haven't showed us that they've developed these submarines yet. So and there's only one under construction that we know of that would be able to handle a large ballistic missile with a longer range. But yeah, Kim Jong-un promised a lot more in this regard back in 2021. So
all right, well, let's wait and see how that goes. Thanks very much for coming on the show, Colin. I hope you'll stick around and listen to my interview with Eric Penton-Voak, former British coordinator on the United Nations panel of experts on North Korea.
Thanks, Zwirko.
Ever wondered what lies beyond the inter-Korean border? NK News brings you an opportunity to explore North Korea from a near distance. From October 8 to 17, 2023, journey with us on the second ever North Korea from a Distance tour, visiting key border locations and observatories looking into North Korea, as well as meeting key figures working on DPRK issues. Spend 2 nights on the East Coast, see the beautiful Kumgang Mountains, scour the beaches near the inter-Korean border, and see Kim Il-sung's old summer house. Visit Yeonpyeong-do, the location of the November 2010 inter-Korean artillery bombardment. Observe North Korean hamlets from close quarters in Ganghwa and delve deep into the heart of Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Every step of the way, you'll be guided by leading NK News and Koryo Tour staff and be joined regularly for multi-day portions of the itinerary by leading experts like Andrei Lankov, Chad O'Carroll, Jongmin Kim, Jacko Zwetsid, and Gergo Vachi of Koryo Tours. As a special offer for our podcast listeners, quote podcast when making your booking for an exclusive 10% discount. Find out more at nknews.org/tour. Once again, that's nknews.org/tour and use the code podcast when booking. Let's journey into the unknown together. And for this week's feature interview, I am joined in the NK News studio by Eric Penton-Voak, the former coordinator of the UN panel of experts on the DPRK. He left in April of this year to talk about the future of UN sanctions monitoring and implementation, and of course how the panel of experts works. So thanks for joining me on the show, Eric.
Jacko, hello. Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
How long were you working in the UN panel of experts on the DPRK sanctions?
So I was there for 2 years. Experts have a contract of 1 year and have to renew that contract if they want to stay, and their performance is okay, up to a maximum of 5 years.
Okay, so there is a sunset clause and 5 is the max.
5 is the max,
right.
Yes.
And you left after 2, and we'll probably find out why as we go throughout the chat. What kind of career path prepared you for that task? I mean, can I apply to be the coordinator of the UN panel of experts?
I'm sure the UN would welcome your application, Jacko. You have a great expertise in North Korea, and you seem a nice chap. I fear, however, you wouldn't get the job.
Does one have to be a diplomat or
No,
former diplomat?
No, you don't have to be a diplomat.
Okay.
But you do have to tick a number of boxes to get the job. My own boxes were ticked by a long career in the British Foreign Ministry.
Okay. And what other, like for other people or from other countries, what other kind of boxes are there that one would have to tick?
Fundamentally, you have to have worked on the subject of DPRK and sanctions enforcement for at least 10 years. Now, there are a number of ways you can have done that. The panel has had academics, but mainly they are former government officials, and they are from some very specific countries.
Yes, I've written down some notes here. So I understand that the panel composition is the members of the P5, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So we're talking the United States, Russia, China, France, and Great Britain. So that's the P5. Plus, there's also on the panel of experts, there's Japan is represented, the Republic of Korea, and another country. Is that other country, currently Singapore, is that a rotational thing on a year-by-year basis, or how does that work?
So, yes, you're absolutely right. When the panel was first created, there were 7 experts on it, and they were the representatives, so to speak, of the P5 plus Japan and Korea.
Right.
And then it was extended a couple of years later to include an 8th. And that particular expert is always from another country. Yes, you're right, currently Singapore.
And does that change year by year?
Not year by year. It's dependent on the expert. If the expert moved on, it would change with them, and the job would be advertised, and there would be no guarantee that the next expert would come from Singapore.
Right. It could be potentially any UN member state, I suppose.
It could be from anywhere, yes. Although you couldn't have 2 representatives from the same country on the panel.
Right. And so were you functioning as both the UK's representative on the panel and the coordinator?
So I was an expert. My responsibility was regional security and non-proliferation. And then there's an additional responsibility imposed upon one of the experts to be the coordinator of the panel. And that was me too. I would be slightly cautious about saying I was the representative of the UK because that's precisely what experts are not employed to do.
In theory, it's actually supposed to be an independent body with people drawn from P5 countries, but not actually representing those countries' interests and not sent from the permanent mission to the United Nations of those 5 countries, of all those countries. Am I correct?
Exactly right. I mean, the national membership of the panel is consistent, but the panel is specifically employed to be impartial and independent.
Right. Are the members of the panel, are they UN employees?
No, they're not.
They have
it's
a sort of a strange...
slightly strange, as you say, a slightly strange status within the UN. The experts are not UN full-time employees. They are consultants to the UN and employed as consultants, actually formally by the Security Council on an annual contract.
And also paid by the Security Council?
Paid by the UN,
okay.
But as consultants.
Right.
And there is some extraordinary opacity regarding some of the roles and responsibilities of consultants within the UN. The UN employs a huge number of consultants, IT consultants and so on and so forth around the world. Experts are not quite normal consultants either. They are experts on panels, and there are a number of things associated with their contracts that distinguish them from other consultants too. But it's by no means very clear.
And so you're supposed to be beholden only to the Security Council, or to the Sanctions Committee, not to whatever country you're from.
In principle, that is absolutely the case, yes. You are reporting to the UN as an independent, impartial observer.
Okay, now you left after 2 years. Is that because the job was difficult?
Yes, fundamentally. There were a number of domestic reasons. I was in New York on my own. My wife chose not to accompany me to New York, and that was tough as well. But I wouldn't say that was the primary reason why I chose to leave the panel. I simply didn't like it very much. It's a very, very challenging and very frustrating job, and sometimes it's quite a lonely one. And frankly, I'd had enough after a couple of years.
Well, then let me switch to a light question. What song lyric from UK band The Smiths would best describe your work related to the UK?
Jacko, that's an extraordinary left field question. But fortunately enough, you were kind enough to warn me in advance that you were going to ask me.
I did. Full disclosure, listeners, I did in fact. This is the only question I told him in advance that I was going to ask him.
Yes, so I love the Smiths, and your question actually caused me to fly back to their albums to have a look to see which lyric best suited my job. And there are so many lyrics by the Smiths that might apply. I mean, any band that can have a song title, what difference does it make? Or Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now, or even an album, The World Won't Listen.
Please let me get what I want.
Please, not quite so much actually. I didn't write that one down, but there were two that I chose, Jacko. If you'll indulge me.
Yeah, please.
So, frankly, Mr. Shankly, this position I've held, it pays my way, but it corrodes my soul. I thought was quite apt. And also, I was looking for a job, and I found a job, and heaven knows I'm miserable now. I thought were probably the most descriptive.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to read a little explanatory bit from the bio that you sent me beforehand. The panel is an independent group of 8 experts tasked with reporting twice annually to the Security Council on the implementation of UN sanctions on the DPRK. The reports, which are agreed by the consensus of the experts, contain detail of breaches of the sanctions regime and recommendations on how to close the loopholes of the existing regime. Now, could you remind our listeners why there are and continue to be sanctions in place on the DPRK?
The UN's sanctions regime on DPRK kicked off quite a long time ago, and I hesitate to say exactly when, but it was but Resolution 1718 in 2007. I'm no longer an expert, Jacko. So
the first nuclear test was 2006, so I want to say it was probably the year after that or something.
1718 was the first sanctions resolution. It wasn't the one that created the panel of experts, which was created with 1874 and 2009. But the series of sanctions resolutions were imposed by the UN in order to prevent DPRK from developing weapons of mass destruction, but also with an eye on easing the tensions on the Korean Peninsula as a whole and seeking a political solution to the problems that have affected the peninsula.
Are they designed to be punitive? Is that the intent of sanctions?
No, that is not the intent, although there is an argument that that's what they can appear to be. And there is an aspect to sanctions which is didactic. It teaches other countries that might want to be developing WMD that actually there will be consequences if they do so, contrary to the wishes of the international community. They're not punitive, they're targeted measures, and the UN has learnt a great deal about how to create sanctions that actually achieve its aims over the years. Obviously, there's a huge debate about the efficacy of sanctions, what they actually achieve. Maybe we'll go into that, but that's not the function of the panel. The panel is simply there to look at what the sanctions are trying to achieve, and reporting on how they're implemented.
Yeah. So if they were implemented fully and effectively by all member states, what do we imagine would be the desired outcomes of the sanctions with regards to DPRK?
So the sanctions are only part of the process, and that is often forgotten. That there ought to be, and sometimes has been, a political process going on behind the scenes, which is seeking to persuade the DPRK leadership to abandon their WMD programs and to come to some sort of political agreement with the ROK government.
And how effective? Well, okay, so one of the first things that I remember being sanctioned in the time after the first North Korean nuclear test in 2006 was probably in 2007, there was this ban on the importation of luxury goods. That was the first area that was really comprehensively sanctioned. So they were targeting things like high-end alcohol and perfume and cars and cigars and things like that. And I'm wondering, this is going back to, as I said, probably 2007, so 16 years now. How effective are those sanctions? It's one of the longest lasting areas, and yet luxury branded alcoholic beverages seem to still be available in Pyongyang this year.
Yeah. So the sanctions resolutions on DPRK have got better over time.
When you say better, is it more targeted, more pointed?
Yes, exactly. Much clearer about what they're trying to achieve and who they're aimed at. The luxury goods provisions of 1718 were aimed at the elite surrounding the DPRK leadership, and I think reflected a feeling in New York and in diplomatic circles that actually these people were developing weapons and testing nuclear warheads whilst enjoying the best things that the world had to offer. And so there were provisions written about sanctioning luxury goods. The trouble is, and those sanctions are still in place, that luxury goods still should not be going to DPRK, in order to make it clear to the DPRK elite that the world is unhappy with the development of WMD. But I'm not sure it was terribly well constructed, and particularly as luxury goods have never actually been defined. And I mean, I know what a luxury good is. It's generally something that I probably can't afford. But actually, it is extraordinarily difficult to identify the line. And there are some cultural issues on that as well. What is a luxury in the US might very well not be in another country.
Now, currently, the United Nations sanctions regime on the DPRK is probably the most wide-ranging set of measures imposed on a UN member state in history. Is this a strength or a weakness?
So they're definitely the most wide-ranging series of sanctions. In terms of strength and weakness, you could argue it either way. It does, firstly, there's a problem in that it looks punitive. Secondly, you're simply heaping more and more forbidden things on a regime that might dig in response to each and every new resolution. On the other hand, and this is where the panel comes in, each and every resolution responds to previous loopholes that the panel has sought to identify. And so over time, the understanding of what the DPRK is trying to do, what it requires to do, what it requires to obtain to achieve its aims, become clearer and clearer. And increasingly those things are the things that are sanctioned in each subsequent resolution. So there's some strength in it, but there are some weaknesses as well, I think, in the width and the depth of some of these sanctions.
Now, the panel of experts, so that's the 8 of you in this organization, your job is to investigate things and then to write a report on them, which is then submitted to the Sanctions Committee and to the Security Council. Do you, in that process, do you liaise or attempt to liaise with the DPRK permanent mission to the UN stationed in New York?
No. Well, at least while I was coordinator, that didn't happen. I'm not sure if my predecessors on the panel have been in touch with the DPRK mission. The DPRK has its own views on the efficacy of the UN sanctions regime. It doesn't recognise them.
Does it try to submit things, statements, appeals, protests?
Not directly to the panel, no. At least not while I've been in the job.
Yeah.
The DPRK tends to completely ignore the panel of experts and its role. Sanctions are simply a bad thing that are massively criticised by the DPRK, but the mechanisms of their enforcement are very rarely referred to, I think.
Okay, now so the panel of experts releases reports twice a year. That's part of its mandate. And it often seems like draft reports are leaked well in advance of the actual reports coming out. Can you comment on that?
I can comment on it. I can't explain it, really. The panel's drafting processes are indeed completely confidential, and no one on the panel talks outside of the group about its investigations.
And that's a months-long process, right?
The actual drafting is about a month, maybe slightly less. But actually, when the panel gets together, either in person or on Microsoft Teams, to draft the report, that is a confidential process. But the report, as soon as it is completed and agreed by the panel, is then sent off in a draft form to the committee, the 1718 committee, which oversees DPRK sanctions. And the 1718 committee gets the first look at the report. At some stage, the panel report seems to leak, and that's a pretty predictable
This is after it's been handed to the 1718 committee.
Indeed. It has not, at least it hasn't recently. I can't comment on earlier, but recently it hasn't leaked until it's got to the committee. And I don't think the panel report leaks from the panel itself. The panel takes a number of IT precautions to try and ensure that is the case. They are really quite tough restrictions inside that actually hamper the drafting of the report, but which the panel has taken upon itself voluntarily in order to prevent it from being accused of leaking the report itself. But as soon as it's out in the wild, it does seem to be leaked, and some really don't like that. I mean, I don't like it either, particularly if the panel or even myself are blamed for that. And I was asked to explain why on earth it was happening several times. I think I can explain why it happens. I think members of the 1718 committee see a report that is by then actually an unclassified report. It's been agreed by the panel and will be published, subject to the agreement of the 1718 committee and the Security Council. It will be published as an unclassified document on the UN website, and it won't be changed substantively from when it leaves the panel to when it's published. So the content of it is not actually sensitive or will not be sensitive. It's simply it's a procedural thing that the committee likes to look at it first and be seen to approve it. But I can see why some members of the committee might want to publicise the main stories contained in the panel's report. That's up to them. It's quite annoying, but you can see why it happens.
So the most recent report, which I downloaded from the UN website, I think it came out in February this year, if I'm correct?
I think it was published in March. Actually. I think it was the 6th or 7th of March it was actually published. But the panel submitted that, I can't remember the date, but it was at some point at the end of January, maybe the 29th or 30th, I think. And then it will have gone through the committee for a month. Then it will have gone, after another pause, to the Security Council. And then it has to be edited through a long process where commas are inserted in the right place.
Edited for form, not content, right?
That's right. The panel's report has a very strict word count, and when we draft it, we use the initials DPRK to refer to the country that is sanctioned. But as a formal UN document, acronyms for countries are not permitted.
I did not know this.
So the DPRK has to be expanded to say the Democratic People's Republic of Korea each time we use the acronym in the report, which
so
actually makes it
one word to four.
Exactly, it makes it one word to four, which actually you mentioned DPRK quite a lot in a report, and it is quite frustrating. It also makes for very, very clumsy reading.
Yes.
It's absolutely infuriating to have to use the full name of the country, but the UN rules are the UN rules, and they will be followed.
So this report contains 81 pages plus many times more that in 95 annexes. So the whole document is 487 pages in total. Who's supposed to read all that in the ideal world?
You are, Jacko. Everyone's supposed to read it.
I didn't get through all the pages.
So the word count, I should explain, applies to the main text only.
The 81 pages.
The 81 pages. The annexes have slightly less attention paid to them in terms of editing, and sometimes there's that it's not translated, so it's in the original languages. The annexes contain the evidence, or the bulk of the evidence, that the panel has used to come to the conclusions expressed in the main text. And they contain some really interesting detail that
a lot of photographs too, listeners. You'll find a lot of satellite imagery, for example, and tables of ship names and stuff.
Oh, there's all sorts of good stuff in there.
It's really, for the geeks out there, you can really geek out over this stuff.
So that is where the actual evidence for our conclusions are. The report, the main report, although it is evidence based, our investigations are detailed, but we simply, for word count reasons, simply can't go into the sort of detail that might be required. So some of the drafting in the main text is actually very, very condensed, and quite complex ideas are expressed in as few words as possible, and it can be quite a difficult read. Although we do try quite hard to make it accessible to people who don't look at DPRK sanctions evasion on a daily basis. But fundamentally, it's written for the Security Council to take action, and so we expect UN member states to read the report. Possibly not the annexes. I think the panel would like to think that we can be trusted to provide evidence for our claims and be relied upon for the accuracy of those claims.
Is it accurate? Do you stand behind the last report that you put out before you left the panel?
It is accurate, Jacko, yes.
What level of confidence?
Sometimes there are slip-ups. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there are things that are misunderstood or actual simple typos, the names of ships or the names of individuals and things like that. But those things happen. The panel is human, but in general, the evidentiary standards are very, very high on the panel's report for the most part, and we're these are people's lives that we're and their livelihoods that we're talking about. There are consequences for people and entities who are named in the report, and we need to be sure that it's accurate before we publish.
Has the DPRK ever, through its mission in New York, said we'd like to make a couple of corrections?
No. The DPRK doesn't recognise the work of the panel and never comments on its reports.
Okay. Now, the panel, the reports are quite granular in terms of specific breaches of sanctions. So are there fundamental big picture issues that the panel of experts doesn't or cannot deal with?
Yes, there are, Jacko, some quite significant issues that the panel can't report on. There are a number of reasons for that. It is a pretty tactical document. It contains a huge quantity of individual cases of sanctions evasion by individuals or entities. There's a lot of, as you've mentioned, specific ship names, but there are company names in there that we believe, as a result of our investigations, have been involved in sanctions evasion. But the overall picture that it paints is fundamentally a very detailed and tactical document of specific cases of sanctions evasion. The panel is not able, for a variety of reasons, to come to the bigger picture oversight about the state of implementation of sanctions, and that's because of some internal tensions, I think, and some failings of the panel's structure.
In what ways have sanctions on the DPRK and their implementation become politicized over the last few years?
Well, that's the issue. And fundamentally, as we've discussed, the panel experts are recommended by a small number of nation states. And so that's inherently political when you look at who those nation states are. Those panel experts are appointed with the approval and support of those countries. However, they are appointed as independent experts, and most of the panel are able to rise above their own personal nationality and act as impartial and objective observers of a phenomenon, the breach of sanctions. However, that's not the case for all the experts, and that is a problem in drafting a report when the playing field on which the experts are operating is not level, when people are actually representing the interests of their states rather than the facts.
Okay, so and the reports are written by consensus, so everyone has to agree on everything that goes into the report, right?
Yes.
So presumably, if there's there's 8 of you on the panel, and if one person is from country X, and there's an annex that says country X collaborated with the DPRK in breach of sanctions in this way, that the independently appointed representative on the panel who happens to come from country X may say, well, I'd actually rather that not go into the report. Is that kind of how it works?
So that's how it works for some countries, Jacko. Yes, it's a tricky thing, but impartiality and independence are really pretty easy concepts to understand. And I used to relish any mention of the UK because actually I thought, yes, we need to mention this.
You mean whether in cases where the UK had either slipped up or been lax in implementation of sanctions, or somebody from the UK? There was a story I think in the media recently where a Britain-based, now deceased insurance broker was doing things with North Korea that were in breach of sanctions.
Yes, I remember that. That wasn't from my time on the panel, but I remember that case. And it's only right and proper that if individuals from particular countries are breaking sanctions, then the panel should be able to highlight that. Now, there are issues with that, of course. And actually, there were very, very few individuals or entities involved in the UK while I was the coordinator. But actually, as an impartial observer of what's going on, I used to relish the mention of the UK because it was enabled me to demonstrate that I was not representing the interests of the UK in doing my job. That's not the case for all the experts, and that is a fundamental problem.
Okay, so now, if an individual from country X is doing something, that's one matter. But if a whole country X is somehow not implementing sanctions, and that country also happens to be represented in the panel of experts, that makes things that's a whole different kettle of fish, isn't it?
It is a whole different kettle of fish, and that is fundamentally the kettle of fish that I've been trying to deal with over the last 2 years. There are, as I say, independence and impartiality are not difficult concepts, but in some countries they are. Right. And that is particularly difficult when those countries are also not really implementing sanctions as they might.
Now, we're kind of skirting around the issue and not mentioning the elephant in the room because you're under a confidentiality clause. You can't say certain things and have to be tactful in public. I understand that. Yeah. How heated could those meetings get, those consensus-building meetings where, there's evidence presented, you're writing a report together, and some people on the panel said, you can't put this in?
Yes. So, I apologise for skirting around things. I think I've become too used to being cautious with my words. And it's necessary to be cautious with words, I think, in public. But I hope listeners can kind of appreciate what I'm saying. I must stress that although there is a confidentiality agreement in my UN contract, it doesn't involve this. I mean, I'm not allowed to talk about investigations that are ongoing. As the coordinator, I'm allowed to talk about stuff that the panel has published, but I can't talk to anyone about ongoing investigations, and I wouldn't do that.
Okay. Now, as well as containing the results of investigations, the report also has recommendations at the end of each section, and then the last annex number 98, I think it is 5 pages of consolidated recommendations from all the different sections of the report. And in that most recent report that came out in March of this year, the panel recommended that the Sanctions Committee consider renewable and standing exemptions for humanitarian aid actors and humanitarian-related commodities, and also emphasise the urgency of re-establishing a durable banking channel to allow the sustainable resumption of humanitarian operations. Listeners to this podcast and people who have engaged with the DPRK over years will know that there are often unintended harmful consequences on humanitarian activities because of sanctions. So obviously, these recommendations would be a good thing if they were followed. Now, although, of course, the DPRK has yet to open its doors to work by outside groups on humanitarian issues since it shut them in January 2020 with COVID. But are these recommendations, these two that I just mentioned, are they likely to be followed by the 1718 committee or the Security Council?
So the recommendation on the banking channel is fundamental, and each panel report for some time has recommended the re-establishment of a banking channel.
Oh, so this is nothing new?
It's nothing new.
Okay.
It's just a very, very difficult problem to solve. Humanitarian work in DPRK absolutely relies upon an ability to finance those operations. And without a banking channel, they have a fundamental difficulty in performing their humanitarian function. Actually, they are forced to use cash, which is
carrying in a bag, basically,
which has enormous risks.
Yeah.
Of course, this hasn't been the case for the last 3 years because the country has been closed, and my period on the panel coincided with COVID.
Right.
And so that banking channel issue, although it still needs to be resolved, and I think the UN Secretariat has made steps recently on a one-off solution which enabled some money to be paid into DPRK in order to facilitate these operations. There's still a massive issue to be addressed there. The other recommendation is possibly less likely to be implemented, although I can't say. These are recommendations for member states, fundamentally, who make up the UN to implement if they so choose. And the first group of member states are the 15 on the Security Council, who make up the 1718 committee as well. And they need to think whether or not this is a good idea or a bad one. The panel recommends simply that it's considered. We don't take a position on whether it's a good idea or not. And I would say that some of that chapter in particular of each report is extraordinarily debated on the panel, and is actually the cause of quite a lot of quite visceral argumentation, because actually there seems, to some of the panel at least, that there's very little evidence of some of its assertions. It's also an extraordinarily political subject, whereby some member states think one thing and other member states think something completely different. And those arguments come out in the panel's report when they really shouldn't. The panel's report really should be a technocratic, evidence-based report and not an opportunity for political assertion. But I'm afraid it's not an ideal world we live in, Zwirko.
Yeah. So perhaps it was a good thing that your report writing meetings were held on Microsoft Teams rather than in the room?
I think that's probably the case. I was never in a in-person discussion of the panel's report and the drafting processes which took place. Because of COVID, we were always simply negotiating through screens.
Yeah.
But my predecessors and doubtless successors will once again return to a room to discuss these things. And I understand anecdotally there were some very tense physical moments in the past, because these negotiations can get very, very heated.
Yeah. Now, are there traces, signs that we can see in the written report of disagreements where, something's been taken out of the main body, but we can find it elsewhere?
Yep, there are. The panel's working methods means that we always seek consensus and try to find a wording that reflects everyone's views. Obviously, that's not always possible. And in those cases, the working methods are quite specific, that if any expert disagrees fundamentally with something that the panel's report has been asserted and no consensus language can be found, then there is the option to insert a footnote in which the dissenting expert or experts can explain why they disagree. In principle, those footnotes are supposed to be evidenced as well. This is the reason that I don't think that this is correct. They rarely are, but if you want to look for places where the panel finds agreement particularly difficult, you look for the footnotes. Where experts, a number of experts, it's usually two, but it's not always two, experts disagree for reason X.
Now, there are, as I said, 98 annexes in hundreds of pages. I didn't go through all of them, but I did find an interesting one in annex number 26. That's a response to the panel by the People's Republic of China. The permanent representative of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations in New York wrote a short letter to the panel of experts. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that letter and what it means.
Yes, Annex 26 was an interesting one. I don't think the previous panel reports have ever amassed responses by any member state together in one place. But that was how China sent their responses to our letters. And I should explain that every 6 months, as part of its investigations, the panel sends out letters to countries and to entities asking a series of very detailed questions.
This is Annex 92 then, the questionnaire on sanctions implementation.
No, this is different. This is different. This is the investigation form takes the part of a series of letters sent out in my name but drafted by the expert to member states.
Right.
And so we write these letters, outgoing correspondence, OCs, to member states, and China receives quite a lot of these every 6 months, and they choose to collect their responses to all the letters we've sent and send them back to the panel in a package. And in this case, they were under cover of a letter from the ambassador, which sort of introduced the report of their responses. I think it's a really interesting document. What you see is a diplomatic position. The Chinese ambassador says that his country solemnly and faithfully implements sanctions and supports the panel in everything it does.
Even at loss to itself.
Even allegedly at loss to itself, although that phrase has never been explained. And then there's 6 pages of responses, formal responses to our letters. And I think the contrast between the tone of the ambassador's letter and the tone of almost all of the individual responses to the panel's questions could not be clearer.
So there's a disconnect between those two.
There's a very senior Chinese official saying we support the work of the panel, and then 6 pages of a demonstration of precisely how China does not support the work of the panel in any way.
So we saw no breaches. We saw nothing.
We saw nothing. Oh, and by the way, the panel should not publish anything along these lines in its report, which is, it's external influence on the panel's reporting, which is unseemly.
Now that does seem like a double position to take there. We can only speculate since we are not in contact with the PRC government. But I'm just wondering, you've been a diplomat for a long time. What's to be gained by saying, on the one hand, we support these, we uphold these, we enforce these, and on the other hand, to turn a blind eye?
Well, that question is certainly best addressed to a representative of the Chinese government. But I can speculate.
If you're listening, you're welcome on the show.
I think China doesn't want to appear to be an irresponsible member of the international community, and indeed quite the opposite. It wants to appear to be responsible, and hence the ambassador's words. But the actual reality is that there's very little implementation, if any, by China of the sanctions on DPRK. And I think their responses to our very, very detailed questions. I mean, each one of those letters that they send 2 or 3 lines back is 4 or 5 pages long. It contains satellite imagery. It contains a lot of information and some very, very detailed questions, most of which the Chinese government seeks to ignore and to tell us something that actually we haven't even asked, which is extraordinarily frustrating.
Now, another annex there, Annex 68, has some imagery analysis that shows a train from the DPRK hitting certain stations in Russia. And there's a quote there in the annex that says, "The panel cannot confirm the claim that the train was used to transport ammunition." And also it goes on, another quote, "Two experts are convinced it is premature to include any assessments by the panel before exercising due diligence in collecting evidence and conducting investigation according to the panel's standard." Now, on this podcast, we've talked a lot about this question before, about the question of are North Korean weapons produced in the DPRK being shipped to Russia to use in its war on the Ukraine. Am I right in understand that they may have been moved, but the case has not yet been proven according to the panel's standards?
I think that's exactly right, Jacko. The panel has high evidentiary standards, and we haven't been unable yet to see DPRK weapons being exported from DPRK to Russia for use in the war in Ukraine. But one member state, the US, has said very explicitly and very publicly that is the case. And indeed, there was a picture in the, I think it was the New York Times, it may have been CNN, of an empty train. Now, the panel wasn't initially sent that picture. It appeared in the press. But we did ask the US about this story because obviously a breach of the arms embargo, particularly by a member of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, is a really significant issue. And the US sent us that photograph. Annex 68, did you say? We did our own investigation, and actually my colleagues are to be really credited with finding that imagery. The UN provides the panel with some commercial imagery, and we've become really quite good at using it. But that was particularly difficult to find. But the imagery showed a train at one time of day on the Russian side of the border, and then a few hours later, the same train on the DPRK side of the border. It was empty on both sides of the border.
How do you know that?
Well, you can see it's not carrying it. It's a flatbed truck, a series of flatbed trucks, and there's nothing on.
Okay, so it's just the empty rail car.
It's the empty rail car,
okay.
Yeah. And some think tanks have been watching that border for some time, and they've been able to show satellite imagery with goods coming both ways across the border. Of course, sending an empty train from Russia to DPRK is not in itself.
Yeah, by itself, it's not dispositive.
It's not a breach of sanctions. There's nothing in that actually breaks any of the sanctions resolutions, and so the panel found itself in a slightly difficult position. And the panel needs to operate under the terms of its mandate and can really only investigate if there's reasonable cause to think that sanctions have been broken. And some would argue that an empty train is not a breach of sanctions, and so is no business of the panel.
Would you be among that some?
I don't happen to agree with that. I thought that the imagery analysis that was conducted by experts on the panel was significant enough to publish in our final report, although we were absolutely assiduous in noting that we hadn't yet found any evidence that arms were transported on that train.
Right.
And indeed, it may be the case that arms were not transported on that train. I don't personally happen to think that's the case. I think that actually the US thinks that arms were transported. They probably have some sensitive material. I don't know. I haven't seen it. But they probably have good reason to think so. And that's the reason why they've published that in the media and provided the information to the panel. But we couldn't prove that, and it's really important. If you are an impartial and independent observer, you say, look, this is interesting, but it doesn't prove anything yet. But it is an interesting fact that train did go from Russia to the DPRK. And you have to question, what is the purpose of sending an empty train to DPRK? Of course, it could have been used to transport turnips or something else. Kohlrabi as well, or something that didn't breach sanctions. And if that were the case, then fair enough. But I think it would be the act of a responsible UN state to say, actually, that train was used to carry turnips and not weaponry, and to provide some evidence for that.
Bill of lading, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there must be customs documents and all sorts of things that would be possible to find. The issue with this story, though, is a pretty fundamental one for the panel. This is a story about arms from DPRK to Russia, neither one of which is going to cooperate on this subject with the panel. So we wouldn't ask DPRK if they'd exported arms to Russia. That would make us look silly. We would ask Russia, and have asked Russia. The answer, I'm afraid, I didn't see before I left the panel. But I imagine it will be in the next report. But actually, if Russia is breaking the arms embargo, they're unlikely to respond to a letter from Eric Penton-Voak saying, "Oh yes, you caught us red-handed, well done." I suspect that whatever their answer is unlikely to be accurate, and that is a fundamental issue when the panel is asked to investigate things that are actually beyond the reach of a group of 8 people with the best will in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you find out about that?
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of information. Open source intelligence is a growing feature, and is what the panel practices. But actually, we're looking at a very, very high bar of evidence that we have to produce, and open source intelligence is unlikely to produce it in this case.
Why does the panel have to do all its work in New York City? Why couldn't you all be based in, say, Shenyang or Dandong and look at things up close from the ground? And that would be a great response, perhaps, to the letter from the Chinese mission. Just write back and say, thank you for your continued support of the panel of experts. We'd like to, for 6 months of the year, have our office in Dandong.
Jacko, as I say, you're welcome to apply to the panel of experts. I think your creative thinking would be welcome. Actually, when I spoke to the Chinese mission, they did say they would like a visit from the panel to Beijing.
Yeah.
And I said there were a number of things that I would personally like to go and look at. But of course, at the time that I was coordinator, China was also closed because of the COVID pandemic made that very difficult. I imagine the panel will go to China in the future, but I'm not quite sure what it will be shown.
Last week, on Thursday, there was this big parade in North Korea that I thought at first was to celebrate the 300th episode of this podcast series, but it turns out it was actually for the 70th anniversary of the signing of the armistice that put the Korean War on pause, a parade that they like to call Victory Day, Victory in the Great Fatherland War of Liberation in the DPRK. And at this parade, there were some senior delegations from both Russia and the People's Republic of China. And at the very end of the parade, almost at the very end, the two chief delegates there, Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and China's Communist Party Politburo member Li Hongzhong, I think, both applauded the North Korean Hwasong-17 nuclear-capable missiles as they were trundling through Kim Il-sung Square. After seeing that, I wonder what hope we should have that Russia and China are in fact dedicated to stopping North Korea's nuclear development program and will therefore continue to work in good faith with the POE. I know you've left there, you could only speculate, but if you were still sitting there as coordinator, would you at the end of that parade throw up your hands in despair and say, well, what are we doing here?
Well, even as a former coordinator, on seeing those pictures, I still threw up my hands in despair. I mean, a picture paints 1,000 words, and I have to say the presence of the Russian defense minister at an arms exhibition in Pyongyang was almost unbelievable. But it illustrates very, very clearly the level of contempt that Russia has for this particular sanctions regime. I mean, Russia has torn up the UN Charter fundamentally, and so it's perhaps unsurprising that sanctions on a close military partner are ignored. But I must say, I thought the contempt shown to the international community by Minister Shoigu's presence was bewildering. The Chinese delegation was slightly less senior, but actually it said pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
We do not believe in these sanctions, and frankly, we will not implement them.
So that does seem to, on the face of it at least, undermine the work of the panel of experts?
Well, yes, of course it does. I think, if you have two permanent members of the UN Security Council not implementing sanctions to which they have both agreed, that's bad. But what makes it even worse is that, most of DPRK's trade goes through China. 95% of imports come through China. If China is not implementing sanctions, then actually whatever anyone else does is really rather beside the point.
Now, we're heading in the home stretch here, so the last couple of questions. You left in April this year from your position as coordinator of the panel of experts. Now, in 2022 alone, so that's the second year that you were there, the DPRK launched at least 73 missiles, declared the irreversible nature of its nuclear status enshrined in the Constitution, bought new ships for its merchant fleet, and continued ship-to-ship transfers of cargo and coal and oil, and allegedly stole cyber and cryptocurrency assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation in the country declined. These are not good things. What opportunities do you see for improved future panel of expert cooperation and investigation? What would make things better, and what's feasible?
So the panel of experts is responsible for exposing loopholes and describing them and explaining the methodologies employed. It is fundamentally the responsibility of UN member states to tighten up those things. And actually, the thing that would make panel of experts reports better would be if member states actually implemented its recommendations. Of course, as we've just discussed, two nations are not disposed to doing that. And so it's quite hard to see how the work of the panel of experts can be realistically improved. There are a number of things that could be done to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the panel of experts. They would depend on consensus at the UN, which, as we've seen, on DPRK is not possible. In order to make any change in the composition or role or mandate of the panel, everyone would need to agree, and that seems extremely unlikely to happen. So there is a limit to the improvement of the panel's position, and indeed improvement in the implementation of sanctions. There is one thing I think that should be done, and that is that the management of the panel by the UN Secretariat needs to be improved. We all sign the same contract, and yet two experts seem able to constantly ignore the terms of that contract with impunity.
There's no consequences.
With impunity.
Right.
And that is surely not right.
So under the terms of the contract, the UN should be able to use some disciplinary measures or let them go if necessary.
Yeah, of course, it's unrealistic to expect experts from Russia and China not to defend their country's interests. That if they did act independently and with impartiality, they would be removed by their own countries and replaced by people who did do what Moscow and Beijing wanted.
Is that the same for other countries? Some people would, I'm sure there are some anti-imperialists out there who would say, well, I don't imagine that Americans could be independent on such a panel.
So I think that there's different things. I think it's reasonable to expect that individual experts may not actively seek to undermine the interests of their own country. However, there's a difference between people not actively seeking to undermine their interests and actually defending them. There's a lot of countries mentioned in panel reports. Last time, I think Ethiopia was the case in point. If there was an Ethiopian expert on the panel, I don't think he or she would have permitted that story about the Ethiopian chief of staff using DPRK military radios to have appeared. But actually, no one protects the interests of Ethiopia on the panel. However, other experts will defend the interests of their countries and seek to dilute or even remove things that portray their own countries in a particularly unfavourable light. And that's two experts in particular.
Do these two experts, in writing the report, sometimes try to turn the tables and include stuff that could be embarrassing to the Western allies, so France, the UK and the US? A bit of reverse finger-pointing,
So not to a great extent. There's not a great deal. I'm reasonably sure that US and France and the UK do try their utmost to implement sanctions. There may well be individuals and companies in those countries that are involved in sanctions breaking, but I think all three countries would act. The one issue is the luxury goods, to come back to your first question, whereby, and I've seen it in NK News, where there's all sorts of Western products on the shelves of DPRK supermarkets. And the temptation on seeing those reports is for the panel to investigate Johnny Walker whiskey or
IKEA furniture
or Mitsubishi cars or what have you. And all of these, of course, are brand names that actually mean a lot in the West, and some of them are luxury goods, some of them may be changed for military purposes. But the drafting of the report in order simply to name Western goods that might be in DPRK is a misuse of those processes. The issue is not which goods are there. The issue is how they got there.
Yeah.
And almost all of those goods must have gone through Chinese customs. Now, it's up to Chinese customs to impose those sanctions and prevent those luxury goods getting there. But then I come back to that issue that I raised at the beginning, which is that the definition of luxury goods is different. So that aspect of the report, I couldn't say for sure, but I always felt that it was an attempt to muddy the names of Western luxury goods manufacturers, when actually it's the means of delivery of those goods rather than the goods themselves that are at issue.
Well, that brings us to the end of our time today. I want to thank you once again very much for coming on the show. Eric Penton-Voak, former coordinator of the UN Panel of Experts.
Thank you, Jacko. It's been a pleasure.
Are you in contact with Netflix to produce or to scriptwrite a limited series about the politics and the ins and outs and the dramas and the highlights and lowlights of the panel?
I wish I was. I do think there's a rich pickings there for a. It would have to be a comedy, because actually, if it would be too tragic to portray it in all its horror. But I think it could be quite amusing.
Well, The Office came out more than 20 years ago, so perhaps it's time for a new workplace-based drama, dark comedy.
It would be very dark.
Thanks very much again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Jacko.
Let me ask you this. You're listening to the NK News podcast, so you know more about North Korea than most. But how about the South? To really understand what's happening on the peninsula, you need to know about South Korea. And now you can, through our new Korea Pro news and analysis service. This is not your average news service. It's a thoroughly researched analysis of South Korea's politics, society, and economy from an international perspective. But you know what the cherry on top is? The absolute lack of commercial influences. No ads, no sponsored articles. It's just pure, objective analysis by a team of qualified specialists. And the best part? As a listener of this podcast, you get a 25% discount. All you have to do is use the coupon code PODCAST during your sign-up. So head over to koreapro.org/podcast and start your journey with Korea Pro. That's koreapro.org/podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our podcast episode for today. Our thanks go to Brian Betts and Alana Hill for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and fixes the audio levels. Thank you, and listen again next time.